Go ahead, meet your heroes, no matter how crappy they may be. I love terrible cars, especially famous terrible cars. This week I drive the famous, not a LeBaron, a 1989 Chrysler TC by Maserati. In my Sterling 827 video, I commented that as a young teen I had bought Richard Porter's Crap Cars book, and it was pretty integral for my love of weird old cars. Yeah, it was pretty harsh at times, but here were 50 famous automotive failures, each with a vision that failed to land. Well, fast forward almost 20 years and I have my own YouTube car review channel, and I'm on a mission now to review all 50 of those crap cars. This is officially the third of those 50 cars that I've covered, the others being the aforementioned Sterling 800 series and the Suzuki X90. Number 3 is a car that's been pretty high on my list of cars that I've been wanting to showcase on this channel, and it's a car that's the product of a failed marriage between two very different companies. The Chrysler TC by Maserati was supposed to be the grand return of a flagship Chrysler luxury car. Instead, it was an overpriced cousin of a much cheaper product that they already produced. In the 1980s, Chrysler was undergoing a massive shift. The long-time struggling luxury brand was still at the top of Chrysler's brand hierarchy, but it had shifted dramatically down market compared to what they were in the 70s. Even with the failed Imperial brand, where Chrysler attempted to split off its flagship into its own brand to compete more equally with Cadillac and Lincoln, the Chrysler name still had a certain cachet to older generations that sold. But in the early 80s and after another failed Imperial relaunch, Chrysler no longer had cars that really stood above the rest of the greater Chrysler lineup. By the mid-80s, Chrysler's Fifth Avenue, New Yorker, Town & Country, and Conquest could all be described as gussied-up Dodges and Plymouths. Go ahead, Mopar guys, yell at me all you want. The exception to this was Chrysler's smallest offering at the time, the LeBaron. Initially it was K-based, but by the time the third generation came about, the coupe was split off from the sedan with its own heavily updated platform known as the J platform. And it was a surprisingly sporty little car with its Turbo 4 and available convertible. While not as sporty as its Japanese competitors, it was still a good little car in what was considered a pretty stale lineup at the time. And 2 years later, the TC came around and immediately people compared it to the much cheaper LeBaron. The Chrysler TC by Maserati was to be the return of a flagship Chrysler coupe/convertible. Quite frankly, this car's existence can be blamed on one man, Lee Iacocca. I know, he was beloved for pulling Chrysler out of the doldrums of bankruptcy in a terrible 1970s with a modern small car aimed squarely at imports and shaking up the people mover world with the introduction of the minivan. During this great shift, he also wanted to launch a small luxury convertible to take on Mercedes' SL. Initially, he wanted this to be straight-up K-car based, essentially a convertible Plymouth Reliant with Chrysler badges. But he was, thankfully, talked out of it. After this, he turned to an old friend from his Ford days, Alejandro de Tomaso. Ford supplied V8s for De Tomaso's rear-engine sports car, the Pantera, in the 70s. In 1975, De Tomaso purchased a bankrupt Maserati and built the company back into a respectable luxury and sports car brand. Chrysler would provide the bones and cash, Maserati would provide Italian quality and flair. And a partnership that was supposed to bring out the best of both brands, instead it produced the worst of both in a move similar to that of Honda and Rover with the Sterling. Called the TC for turbocharged coupe, the TC was supposed to launch before the third generation LeBaron as Chrysler's new flagship. This was supposed to showcase the return of the great luxury Chrysler, something that wasn't really a thing since Imperial was split off and the 300 kind of moved down market in the late 60s. But it was not to be. Development was an utter mess with constant squabbling between Chrysler and Maserati's engineers and marketers. This led to delay, and while the third generation LeBaron would launch for the 1987 model year, the much more expensive TC wouldn't launch until 1989. Instead of profiting off of the more expensive car's prestige with the cheaper offering being attainable for the everyman, Instead, the opposite had happened. The LeBaron was already out and doing just fine, and Chrysler was already using the LeBaron to reintroduce themselves into motorsports. By the time the TC came out, it was around $20,000 more expensive at the time. And the similarities to the LeBaron were too much for buyers to justify shelling out the extra cash. On its own, the TC looks like a handsome little coupe. The hardtop with its famous porthole quarter windows comes off and it becomes a true convertible with a soft top that emerges from the slumber. While the coupe LeBaron sits on more aggressive haunches similar to that of a Fox body Mustang if you squint hard enough, the TC has a more elegant wedge shape up front, accented with its big egg crate grille. You'd be hard-pressed to find any sort of Chrysler references here. They really wanted you to know that this was a Maserati product. Supposedly, the pentagoned Maserati coat of arms in the port windows has real 24-karat gold in it. I don't know how true this is, but it was something that some owners had told me. Inside, while you see some Chrysler bones here, it's achingly old-school Italian here. Do you like brown leather? Too bad, because that's 95% of the one color you see here. I assume the black surrounding the gauge cluster is to help prevent the dash from creating glare in the windshield under the sun. It's actually a reason why dashes in racing are black. 6-way power seats, a 10-speaker infinity stereo, stainless steel door jambs and door sills, power door and trunk locks, map lights, puddle lights, cruise control, and a shocking amount of cargo space. Look how deep this trunk is. I was taken aback how deep it was. This is achieved because the spare tires moved to a special compartment behind the front seats that provides additional storage inside. Which is amazing considering that this is a fold-in soft top. Normally in convertibles, you get practically zero trunk and cargo space, but here, Chrysler and Maserati engineered some fantastic storage. In that interior compartment and joining the spare tire would be a standard umbrella and toolkit, like a proper Italian car. The doors, the hood, the trunk, they all have a heft to them that you hadn't really seen in a Chrysler in a long while. All wrapped in this lovely light yellow with these elegant little pinstripes. It looks the part, as long as you don't park it next to a LeBaron and show off its shared bones. Under the hood of this 1989 Chrysler TC by Maserati is probably Chrysler's favorite engine of the 80s, the 2.2-liter Turbo 2 turbo 4-cylinder from the Dodge Daytona. For 1990 and 1991, the trusty Turbo 2 was replaced with another trusty Chrysler fave, the 3-liter Mitsubishi 6G72 V6. For the rare 5-speed TCs, a special quote-unquote Maserati engine was supplied. All in all, it was a Turbo 2 that was built in Italy by Maserati with special innards and parts. So it kind of made it much more of a special engine than that was under the hood of automatic cars, as Maserati had developed it into a 16-valve engine. 1989 models with the Turbo 2 were hooked to a 3-speed A413 automatic, while V6 90 and 91 models were hooked to a 4-speed A604 automatic. For a manual, it was a 5-speed sourced from GetTrag. So yeah, looking at this car and feeling it on the inside and just, yeah, it looks the part. It looks like something special. But then I got behind the wheel and it all kind of falls apart, and the allure of this car and its price tag, $33,000 base that translates to over $61,000 in 2024 money. You can really feel the competing ideologies behind the wheel of this car. The suspension tuning feels tight as it's derived from the Dodge Daytonas in using Feichel and Sachs struts and shocks. There's hardly any body roll to it. But man, the steering is just so lazy with its giant bus wheel not helping things. It's like they engineered it to try to drive like a 60s car while having modern front-wheel drive architecture. It feels like they intentionally tried to make it drive like one of those old boats, and it just doesn't feel pleasant around corners. Those big cushy seats don't help as well, as you kind of bounce and float in them rather than feel like you're secure in the corners. They feel like Barca loungers. This was luxury at the time. And yeah, the Turbo 2 feels great. It just adds to the weird dichotomy as it has that famous Chrysler turbo lag and it revs pleasantly. I know it's supposed to be a tourer and not a sports car, but it feels like those two arguing engineering teams came to life. and it's not a good result. So you have a car that doesn't drive well. It feels overpriced despite Maserati's best efforts to pump it up, and it's aiming for a class of people that haven't walked into a Chrysler dealer in over 20 years. And then you find out that Chrysler lost their ass on every TC they sold. Every TC cost over $80,000 at the time to produce, which translates into $197,000 in 2024 money. At its base price, it cost Chrysler more than double to produce what they were selling them at. Something that the buy-in public and automotive journalists alike both said was overpriced. Bob Lutz said the whole car and partnership was a misadventure, and it would cost Chrysler over $600 million. Iacocca and Chrysler had hoped to sell between 5,000 and 10,000 TCs in a year alone, but they could only muster a measly 7,300 over 3 model years before it finally saw the X. The high cost, a lack of color options, and an undesirable performance would be its biggest criticisms, especially when you can get a similarly designed LeBaron GTC for much cheaper and a wider array of color options. Both Chrysler and Maserati were left pointing the fingers at each other for what went wrong with the TC. And in the end, no one really won. This particular Chrysler TC by Maserati was found by friend of the show, Jarrett of Project Finders in Statesville, North Carolina. The car was originally purchased in Indiana before making its way to North Carolina with its second owner, who purchased it as a late midlife crisis buy when he turned 70. He only drove it for a few years before his own health kept him from driving, and soon his TC sat in the backyard under a blue tarp held down with 2x4s. That questionable storage is the reason why there's little dents across the hood. The TC sat for years in that yard in downtown Statesville before Jarrett was able to buy it from the second owner's daughter. The biggest issue at the time of the purchase was one of the brake calipers having its seals needing replacing. But one brake job later and it runs and drives well with its 68,000 miles. The only other issue is probably a big one. It's that the roof is leaking a lot, which is something they do over time. But despite its questionable storage for years, it's still a solid car, and Jarrett hopes this car can find the TC lover to buy it. Trust me, lovers of these cars will defend them until the end of time. They'll take a sword for these cars, and they will fight anyone who calls these LeBarons. Sure guys, it's a Chrysler Q body, not a J body. I know it was assembled in Milan, but you can't deny that it all comes together in a package that's essentially just a fancy LeBaron. I'm sure my comments for this video will be filled with angry TC owners and fans, and that's fine. You can love and defend any car you want, it's well within your right. I like that this car exists. I like that it was a failed partnership between two industry friends from two very different companies with a whole ocean between them. But this car failed for a reason. And like Sterling before it, it felt like the culmination of the worst of those two companies. The great irony is that both Chrysler and Maserati are both owned by the same company now. Maserati was sold by De Tomaso to Fiat in 1993, and Chrysler itself was purchased by Fiat to form FCA in the early 2010s, after another bankruptcy. But sitting behind the wheel of this rare car, all I can think about is how I discovered this car while reading crap cars when I was in middle school. And now I'm making YouTube content with these cars, and I'm collecting them like Shitbox Infinity Stones in my Shitbox Infinity Gauntlet that this channel is. 1989 Chrysler TC by Maserati, a failed car from a failed marriage. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you once again for watching another episode of Wookie Drives. Once again, huge shout out to Jarrett of Project Finders for letting me review one of his many projects for this show. I'll be sure to link Project Finders in the description of this video. Go check him out. He's located in Lincoln, North Carolina, and he's always got some sort of weird project going on. If you have a car or truck you'd like to see on the show and happen to be in the Charlotte or Mooresville, North Carolina area, email me a submission of your car at wookiedrives@gmail.com. That's right, submit your car to wookiedrives@gmail.com. That's wookiedrives@gmail.com. Don't forget to give the video a like, drop a comment with some feedback. Any sort of interaction with this video really helps small channels like mine grow in the algorithm. Share with all your Chrysler TC by Maserati friends. And finally, Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell for more Wookie drives like these. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.
Chrysler technology is making Made in America mean something again. With the LeBaron series, turbo power, and a graceful new design, these cars caught the competition sleeping. And Chrysler technology gives turbo New Yorker power and more standard equipment than Buick Electra. Commitments by Chrysler, made good by Chrysler, backed by Chrysler. Because the competition is good, Chrysler had to be better.